Thanks, Yin. Oh, okay, I have to find the proper distance. Thanks, Yin, and also thanks, many thanks to the Lighthouse, that from the first time when we began to correspond, you've been so warm. You're so welcoming. I mean, it was really amazing. And also thanks to you for coming. I wonder if maybe it's better if I speak this way. No, it's still better this way. Okay. So what I'm going to do today, in a very short time, I'm going to speak very schematically about the theme of particularly the last two books that I've published with PM. One is Witch-Hunting Witches and Women, and the other is Re-Enchanting the World. Actually, they are very connected. They are very connected because both of them deal with the transformation that have taken place in the last 3-4 decades in the global economy, but political, social economy, and their effects, on people's life, on the conditions of people's reproduction, and in particular their effects on women, and Witch-Hunting Witches and Women focuses especially on the new forms of violence against women that have been clearly connected with the whole expansion of capitalist relation, and looks into why once again has in the 16th, 17th, 18th century the expansion of capitalist relation has as one of its effects not only mass displacement, pauperization, and but also specific forms of violence against women. So this is one of the topics that I want to talk about. And then the other, Re-Enchanting the World, again goes back to the social economic transformation, in particular those changes in the structuring of the global economy, that are bringing back, they are evoking, the processes that accompanied the rise of capitalism in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Those processes that, Marx and post-Marxist tradition has defined as primitive accumulation, right? Primitive accumulation being all those strategies and the period that created a condition of existence for the formation of a capitalist society. So today, when people look at the restructuring of the global economy, what we call globalization, or what we call the neoliberal turn, there's been continuously a comparison, with the developments that occurred at the beginning of capitalist society, like the expulsion of the peasantry from the land, the attack on the commons, on communitarian relation, right? And basically displacement of masses of people, right? Then thrown into the global labor market, made much more vulnerable to very brutal form of exploitation. And of course, this is a process that has taken place, has taken different forms. Whether you are in Africa or Latin America, or whether you are in Edinburgh or in New York. But nevertheless, there have been commonalities, because everywhere, in one form or another, the majority of people, have been very directly attacked in the conditions of their reproduction. So if you are in Africa, chances are that you're suffering from the kind of reforms that the World Bank and the IMF have introduced in the name of economic recovery, which is land privatization in particular, monetary devaluation, disinvestment, withdrawal of the state, from subsidizing healthcare, education, basic necessities, But we have seen many of the same processes also in Europe and the US. I mean, the disinvestment in services and subsidies to basic necessities, and also, the precarization of life, the massive unemployment, precarization. So this is something that is in the background. It's in the background of my analysis, and it connects with a lot of work that has been done by many people in the last decades, to look at the new forms of capitalist accumulation. But then what I've been doing in relation to that has been, again, to look at how these have affected women in particular, and in particular why, as in the 16th, 17th century, they have resulted in a surge of violence against women. And then what has been the response, to this development? What has been the response both to the pauperization, the displacement, and the violence? And this is where I discuss the whole politics of the commons, right? Looking at, all kinds of forms of mobilization, particularly by women, that in response to, again, massive displacement, dispossession, are restructuring, creating new forms of reproduction that are beyond the nuclear family, that are much more cooperative, and where basically people, the principle that people follow is that unless you create collective forms of existence, you are bound to be defeated. You're bound to not be able to survive, and also destined to be defeated in your confrontation with these new forces that are directly undermining, directly attacking people's life, and do not look as expression of a temporary crisis, but in fact more and more seem to be the expression of a long-term crisis of capitalist society, and a direct response to the fact that capitalism sees itself as being in crisis, sees itself as being engaged in a kind of long-term historic stagnation. Which doesn't mean that we have to necessarily rejoice. This might be, a hopeful sign, but the very important thing is always, well, if capitalism collapses, what are we going to replace it with? What kind of society, is going to follow from it? And this is where what kind of struggle we make is all important. What kind of struggle we make is all important. To say anti-capitalism, great, but it's not enough. It's also important to figure out, what the horizon we have in a struggle that is directed to bringing down this society. So, in witch hunting, witches and women, right? I look directly at the question of violence, but I think is a very important point of entry. The issue of violence against women today is really, really central. It's central to so many social movements. For example, that now, starting from Argentina with the Ni Una Menos, right? The notion of Ni Una Menos, it's like traveling around the world. For example, in Italy recently, there were more than 100,000 women in Verona, exactly with that slogan, Why? Because, in fact, the violence has increased immensely everywhere, both numerically and qualitatively. Numerically in terms of murders, in terms of assaults, that are incredible, and but also qualitatively from the point of view of the brutality of this violence, and so it has been important for me, and I think perhaps it has helped also other women to connect what is happening today, you know, with the processes that I'm describing in Caliban and the Witch. Right? In other words, that the work in Caliban and the Witch, the kind of framework that I present there to understand the places of women, reproduction, the witch hunts in the history of capitalism, that work has been kind of helpful also to understand what is happening today, right? In response to developments that, in a way, as I said before, seem to bring us back to a previous time in capitalist society, right? Seem to bring us back. What is that we are bringing us back? We're bringing us back to a period, right, in which you can say economic development, right, was obtained, organized through the maximum of violence. You know, one characteristic of the rise of capitalism is that in all its forms was a tremendously violent process. Yeah, think of, you know, the enclosures in England, Scotland, right? People being pushed off their land, right? And then, of course, being attacked, you know, when they took the road. The basic bloody legislation against the vagabonds, you know, that Marx talks about. Today, the vagabonds are the immigrants. It's really the same process. People displaced, take the road, and then being persecuted because they take the road, hoping to find something better in another place, right? And then also you had the slave trade. The slave trade and the setting up of the plantation economy. Today we have a slave trade. Slavery has never ended in many ways, but today we also have a new expansion of unpaid labor and many, 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 many forms of forced labor. When you look at throughout the world, including forced child labor, we have the colonization process, right? The conquest of America and the beginning of a long history of colonization, right? Well, you know, and one argument that I've always made is that the structural adjustment program that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have forced upon people across the so-called third world. You know, they have imposed it on countries that were just coming out of the anti-colonial struggle, right? Have been a process of recolonization, Now, what I've done in Caliban and the Witch is to say that at the same time that all of this slave trade, you know, the conquest of the America, which produced a tremendous, tremendous amount of silver, a constant flow of silver from the mines of Peru, of Mexico, coming into Europe, mobilizing a money economy. Really, the conquest of America begins above all with silver, and then, of course, with many other products. Right? But what I've been trying to say is that all of those, slavery, colonization, expulsion of the peasantry, right, which all serve to accumulate wealth and labor, were not the only processes. That for a capitalist society to come into existence, you also had to have a special type of attack on the condition of women, because capitalism is a society, is a social system that is dominated by what I call a lust, a hunger for labor. And from that point of view, right, in other words, capitalism is a system based on the idea that labor is the major source of wealth. It's not so much, as they used to say, many capitalist economy. It's not so much the amount of land you own, it's how many workers you can exploit. This is really the difference in a way. It's one important strategic difference between capitalism and other system of exploitation. So given this strategic focus on labor, accumulating labor, right? The first phase of capitalism, you can really see this accumulation of labor, right? The expelled peasants and artisans, right? They all become workers that are open at being propertyless. They are open to the maximum of exploitation, right? And then you have the slave, these masses of people that continuously, for 3 centuries, slavery, 3 centuries, into the 19th century, right? And then the expulsion of indigenous. So the question of labor, I'm saying, well, that question of labor also is a key to understand some of the specific forms of persecution and the specific forms of violence to which women were subjected in the 16th, 17th century, beginning with the witch hunts, right? Because, the witch hunts, even though they express the charges against women in ways that seem very fantastic, right? In reality, accused, targeted particular forms of behavior. And the way I've identified them is being through putting side by side the kind of crimes that were imputed to women accused of witchcraft and the kind of legislation that was being enacted in the same period. And what I found is that, so-called witches were accused of being hostile to children, killing children, cooking them. I mean, a whole story about the witch and the child, right? The enemies of the new life. At the same time, you have all this legislation that is basically giving the state the power to control women's uterus, women's reproductive capacities, women's procreation. You also have a whole new interest in this new developing capitalist class for demography, for demographic growth. Their interest in population, who's born, who's dying. All the town are beginning to keep records. So I'm connecting, right, the witch hunts to actually the need of a new developing capitalist class, right, to control procreation, to control women's reproductive capacities. And because, in a sense, the female body begins to be seen as a machine for the procreation of workers, for the procreation of labor power. I also, in Caliban and the Witch, make a connection between the accusation moved against witches and the need of the capitalist class to regulate sexuality, both to channel sexuality towards procreation, but also because sexuality begins to be seen, as something subversive, something that, for instance, can subvert the work ethic, right? It's part of the regulation of the work day. And it's also important to regulate and discipline women's sexuality in particular, because what begins to happen with the formation of a capitalist society, it's a process that I believe has been very important, and the feminist movement has really brought to the surface, which is the increasing separation between the work of production of goods for the market, and the work of reproduction, the reproduction of people, the reproduction of labor power, etc. These two spheres that in the Middle Ages, in societies that were based on commons, they were based on subsistence, right, were not separated, begin in fact to divide, begins to appear as two separate spheres, right? Why? Well, production is the only area of work that now is recognized as work, and its wage, and particularly in the first century, was mostly male, right? And then reproduction is feminized, right? It's women now who are doing the reproductive work, and their work disappears from what is called the economy, right? It's presented more and more, it's unpaid, it's done by women, and it's presented more and more as something that has to do with women's personality. That's what women do. That's, it's not a social work, it's not work that produces, it's not part of capitalist, the capitalist organization of work. It's just what women do, right? It's totally naturalized, made in. So I'm arguing that the discipline of sexuality, and for instance, through the charge that the woman, the witch, right? That the witch, it's a woman who is particularly dominated by her passion and particularly dominated by lust. And, she's so dominated by lust that she even copulates with the devil, right? So saying that all of that has to do also to criminalize, prostitution, criminalize sex work, criminalize any effort the women would do to gain some money for their work. And I want to say something here that is something I still want to work more on. In the account, in the demonologies were these big treatises. At least several scores were written, maybe 30, 40 demonologies. Demonologies were the treatises that intellectuals began to write to explain what is witchcraft, who are the witches, what do they do, how do you punish them. Okay, so one of the things that of course they always say, and this is also important, is that witches are usually women because women are not really full human beings, right? This story, the women don't really have reason. It's a very big theme. The woman dominated by passion, she cannot control herself, and this explains why it's mostly women who are witches. They are so unreasonable that they are more easily seduced by the devil. But the other theme is, which is a class theme, is to say, women do not really accept their poverty. They become demonic because they don't accept their poverty. And the way they represent the pact with the devil is that the devil arrives in the moment that the woman says, oh my God, I'm so poor, and damn this world, I'm so poor. The devil appears and he says, don't worry, become my servant, work for me, and you're going to have no problem. And he gives us some money. And I'm very intrigued by that because, first of all, it's very matrimonial. Right? It's really almost a symbol of the new matrimonial situation of women. You want to be supported, you want to have some money, come out of your poverty, then, marriage, right? And the man is your boss, and you just basically do what he says that he wants you to do. And in fact, immediately after the money, she copulates with him. So sex and money, sex exchange, the devil gives her the money. And so it's symbolic of the new kind of relation that was being, created, constructed, But it's also symbolic of the fact that for women to take money becomes a demonic act, right? So it connects, for instance, with the criminalization of prostitution. Okay, having very little time and wanting to come quick to the present, right? I'm going to sum up and say that the framework that I developed in Caliban and the Witch, and it's broader than what I've presented now, is one that says, yes, capitalism, to come into existence, to assert itself as a system of exploitation, had to engage in tremendous violence. And actually this violence never ended, because it has been an ongoing process of colonization, dispossession, incarceration of people who have rebelled, etc., wars. But of course there are moments that are particularly important, particularly those moments when capitalism is in crisis. And therefore the violence escalates, like we have seen in the 70s and 80s and to the present, right? Now permanent warfare in so many parts of the world. So yes, capitalism is a violent system, cannot sustain itself except with violence. At the same time, it had specific form of violence against women, in the same way as it had specific form of violence against black people and against people that were colonized. Because capitalism would never have been able to sustain itself except to the continuous creation of hierarchies, except to the continuous creation of division among people. So the racism and sexism are structural elements of a capitalist society. They are not contingent, they are not expression of a perversion or moral degeneration of some governments or individual. No, they are structural elements of the system. Capitalism needs sexism and racism. And we have 500 years and more of evidence, right? When a system for 500 years, in fact, continuously at every turn recreates those divisions, then you know that they are structural. So with this in mind, right, I began to bring this interpretive framework, this scheme, to look at what is happening today. Why, at the very moment that we have a worldwide new expansion of capitalist relations, and again, I said before, new policies, processes that evoke the period of the formation of capitalist society, displacement, dispossession, massive impoverishment, precarization of life, warfare. We also find that there is a surge of violence against women. And what I do, and literally the sum of the ideas that I present in Witch Hunting, Witches and Women, are ideas that come straight from meetings that I've had, you know, with women, in particularly in Latin America, but also in New York, right? Because there's a big effort now to try to understand, to make that connection, so that we don't look at the violence just in terms of, you know, again, some perverse man, right? But instead we see that the violence is always, 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 first of all, institutional. Even when it takes individual forms, it's always institutional. Because even when it takes individual forms, that individual form probably would not exist except for the whole climate of impunity. Or as some feminist sociologists like Jules Falquet and others have shown, except for the continuous militarization of life, right? The growth of armies, everywhere there's an army now, not only formal army of soldiers and an escalation of warfare. Think of what is happening in the Middle East or North Africa, right? But also informal army. Every company, every oil company or mining company has an army now. And then the expansion of, you know, carceral system everywhere, more and more jails. And then security guard and surveillance and so on. And all of that has a consequence. There's a relaunching of a particular type of violent masculinity, right? The men with the gun and the men like killing and everything, and also in the media, the movies, everything. Violence is celebrated. But there are also forms of violence that are directly, specifically related to the changes, the changes in the political economy of today's capitalism. And one of the things that we try to do there is to create a map. You know, they've been trying to create a map to understand. And very briefly, because I don't know how much time do I have. Do I still have 10 minutes? Because I also want to come to... Okay. It's like in this map, right? Important in this map is to see that obviously in different places, the violence taking place is not all of the same form, but there are connections between them. So for example, in Latin America, there's been a lot of work done analyzing why, you know, in so many countries, and particularly in rural areas, from Honduras, Colombia, Mexico, right? More and more you find women being killed, particularly by paramilitary, so-called narco-traffickers, who are in fact are really a kind of, army of the state in many ways, as well as police. And, the analysis connects these deaths directly, with this drive to displacement of entire communities at the service of extractivist companies that are now descending in so many parts of the former colonial world, right? To basically take out, squeeze out of, this region, minerals and petroleum, take over land for agribusiness, or to plant things for the green gasoline. And so one of the analyses is that, in fact, two reasons why women are so brutalized for the surge of violence against women in these areas. One is that today women are many situations in the forefront of the struggle against extractivism, against displacement, because they are directly involved with the reproduction process of their communities. And so, for example, there's a big struggle that is taking place in the Amazonia, both the Brazilian and the Ecuadorian Amazonia, right, against petroleum extraction, as well as other forms of mining. Women are saying, forget about the wages that the companies may bring. All that is very temporary. After a few years of oil drilling, the community is finished. You have to move. The water is contaminated. The crops are poisoned. The land is poisoned. And so clearly the violence is a response to the struggle. That's a very important to remember. The other side is that it seems that to attack women, it's also one of the most direct way to terrorize a population. And there is a feminist, Rita Segato, who has written very eloquently about this issue, that the extra brutality, women are not only being killed, but the bodies are being left in public spaces, or the bodies are now being mutilated, has to do with sending a message to communities saying, do not resist, because we do not know any limits. You're confronting people who don't know any limits, right? Also, connection with the new forms of work. The fact that in the collapse of the wage, in the collapse of formal employment, you find the women who may, at one point, may have worked in the fields, who may have worked in a home, now more and more are taking their reproduction out of the home. More and more now are not working to reproduce a man, a family, or a few children, but are now working, doing reproduction work outside, in the streets, selling a few things, organizing with other women, basically reproducing things actually in the streets, because they need to, in order to survive and gain a little money, they need to market this, market that. And in the public space, they confront a lot of violence by the police, who tries to chase them out, to break down, to confiscate their wear, or other people, often men, who compete with them. They don't want them to be in that space, because the public space is a very contested and immense competition. Also, in the search of work, migration, very violent process. Even before Trump, began to attack and wage a war against migrants and take away their children at the border, with Mexico, migration was extremely violent, as it is in Europe, right? The Mediterranean has been a grave, is a grave. There are more than 10,000 people buried, young African, Middle Eastern men, women, children. That's in obscenity. It's a scandal that this has been able to take place. Same with the, Americas. Women moving into the United States from Guatemala, from Mexico, for weeks before take contraceptives. They know that they're going to be raped. They know that along the way, many things can happen. Again, connected with work, violence and work. The maquila, one of the places of much violence against women, has been in the border between Mexico and the United States, which is an area that has hundreds and hundreds of maquilas. Maquilas are the new plantation, the new slave plantation. The workers are mostly young women, no rules, no labor protection, work 15 hours a day. They close the door, they don't allow you to go out until you finish your quota. Every day you have a quota. Sometimes you finish your work late in the night. And they have found, you may have heard of Ciudad Juarez. Ciudad Juarez is a town, one of the main maquila towns, where for years and years women have disappeared and then, working in maquilas, and then, being left out in the desert, and their bodies, again, very brutalized. So there's been a lot of theories why this maquila area is the area where women disappear. And more, the theory that prevails is that that violence has been very important, very functional to maintain the very brutal form of exploitation that are taking place in those in those places, right? In other words, that without their violence, they would not have been able to keep like thousands of women working for the lowest wages, inhaling chemical fumes if they do electronic work, or inhaling dust, destroying their bodies, and working day and day, etc. So, when you look at the map, you begin to see a whole configuration of conditions that really immediately root, this violence into the, show that is deeply rooted into the new forms of accumulation. And with that, with more time and maybe the question period, also connected with that, we see the return of witch hunting, particularly in Africa, in India. Hundreds and hundreds of women have been killed, again, charged with being witches. A new phenomenon, unexpected. When I was writing Caliban and the Witch, never in my mind, I imagined that in my own lifetime, I would learn of women being burnt again or buried alive, accused of being witches. And so that too, from the analysis I have done, it's very much connected, to the processes that I've described before, as well as, the spreading across the planet, particularly in the areas where destined, what I call the sacrifice zone. Sacrifice zone, capitalism has its own sacrifice zone, the areas that are particularly attacked, particularly squeezed, particularly martyred, usually the ones that have the highest level of wealth, mineral, agricultural. These are usually the countries that are most exploited. And these are the countries, these are the regions where today you find the highest level of violence. And I want to conclude here by saying that it is very important that we look at the economic, social, and institutional sources of this violence. Because this movement that have been developing now, like the Me Too movement in the United States, right, are again, circumscribing the reason why, new forms of violence are existing. They're circumscribing to the fact that there are men of power or men in general who are abusing, the power they have in relation to women. And there is a drive to minimize or to hide the structural, systemic character of their violence. And that's what, in fact, we need to bring out. Because if we don't bring out this character, we really do not have no ways to respond to it. And in terms of response, I want to say quickly 3 things, because I hope in the discussion we can expand. Right? Number 1, as I said before, the institutional character of violence, and also an expansion of what we mean by violence, not only what is done with a gun or with a knife, but violence is also the laws, the policies that are, undermining people's possibility to reproduce themselves. So a policy that devalues money by 1,000%, that shut down, forms of employment, or cuts subsidies to people's life, that's violence, very important. The connection, interchange, constant between individual violence and institutional violence. The question of impunity, the creation of climate impunity, the militarization of life, very important to see that. Also, as far as response, right? Carefulness, be careful in terms of thinking of a response in the form of asking more severe penalties from the state. In the United States, there's been a whole move coming particularly from black women, charging, some of the initiative of feminists in the 70s, which they have defined as carceral feminism, which was, let's work with the police. Let's ask for more severe penalties, which they say always are used against those who are already victimized. Today, to deport immigrants or to attack, black youth, etc. And last, the question of the commons. There's been a lot of discussion about what to do. And there's a lot that is being done. Right? Women are doing a lot of things. Patrolling the neighborhood, self-defense, telephone network, don't walk alone, etc., creating all kinds of ways. But in the end, there's been a consensus that has been growing that the best form of defense is also the kind of commoning of reproduction that I talk about in Re-Enchanting the World. Right? In other words, that strengthening, the ties that we have with each other, and beginning to break down the ways in which our reproduction isolates us from each other, learning about each other's problem, each other's situation, and creating a social fabric that is more cohesive, that is more cooperative, that this, in the end, is the only and best form of the self-defense, and is also a form of self-defense that also begins to transform the community, transform the society, and creates the elements of a different type of world. Thank you.
We have time. We have about 10 to 15 minutes of time for questions. Does anybody have a burning question? We have one.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a brilliant talk. I was just thinking about the disgusting attacks on trans women, both mental and physical, and it seems to me there's two things in terms of what we're speaking about. One, shockingly, trans women are described often as not just being threats to other women, but to children, as you said, we're witches.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, a lot of the people that are coming out with this discussing that trans women stuff are effectively, as well, I think, reducing the status of other women to being just a woman. Effectively, that's what they're saying. If you don't have a woman, you're not a woman. And you don't have a woman, so you're not a woman. But effectively, it's really attacking all women, it seems to me.
Okay. Now, maybe I'll take 2 or 3 points and then, yeah.
I was just thinking, when you're talking about these factories in Mexico and in other poor countries where you have women working in these horrible conditions with chemicals and everything, why is it, do you think, that in these countries women are being working in these factories rather than, say, what it was like here during the Industrial Revolution, where it was men working in factories and women were at home?
And then that's the revolution. Actually, women were working in the factories too. It's only much later that they didn't work in the factories, and for a lot of reasons. But okay, is there another question? Maybe I'll take 3 or 4, and then. So yeah.
There's been some talk about how this new generation of workers are ones that are moving from like the agricultural and like factories into what is like service work, or sometimes understood as like reproductive work. What do you think like the sort of like reproductive change in like service work says about the possibilities for women to work within those systems, but also the ways it might be oppressive?
Okay, all right. Okay, yeah, no, the question of trans, and there's a long history, right? Because already in the witch hunt, for instance, the 16th, 17th century, it was women, but also it was gay people. It was people who were not conforming, sexually. So there's a long story about capitalism brutalizing, and it's part of the same universe of discipline in sexuality, and I think it's extremely important. You're right. When I say women, I say all women, and I say all include in a very, very inclusive way. So that's, yeah. But yeah, clearly today this is a central issue. And the question of, it's not true that women, I think the reason women today are working in the maquila is because these are the only places where they find access to some monetary income, as little as it is. The areas where maquilas have been planted have been so impoverished, have been so stripped of other means of reproduction. These are the areas, the maquila areas are also the areas of the Great Migration where people come into the United States. There is now an outflow of people from Mexico, which has been going on since NAFTA. NAFTA has destroyed the conditions of reproduction of millions and millions of peasants. And so you either migrate or you alternatively work in this sweatshop. This is sweatshop work. It's not that they have much of a choice, right? And that's why I often get very upset when, particularly many feminists begin to say, oh, sex work is the worst type of work, is the most terrible, the most violent. Not true. If you look at the work in the maquila, the violence of their work, it's incredible. And it's violence in every sense. It's violence in every sense. Because the work itself, it is a destruction of the body. But then also there's a lot of violence against it. The question of reproductive work, well, it's not the reproductive work as such. It's that the condition under which now people work in general, right? Work is being precarized, and now the benefits, the limited benefits once associated with it, have been all gutted, right? And so this is a general situation. But I think that what is happening with women who are working outside the home right, is that in most cases, they cannot, with the work they do, gain any kind of economic autonomy, independence, etc. In the United States, most have to do 2 jobs. And in addition to that, most women who work outside the home now have a lot of debts, right? And I say that actually, by looking at the situation of women who are working outside the home, you get the impression that you work for a wage in order to be able to get a loan. If you don't have a wage, you have no credit. You cannot take a loan from a bank or from a company. But if you have a wage, so it turns out that most women who are working outside the home are in debt. In fact, the debtor today is a student or a woman who has a job outside the home, right? And usually the debt, the loan have a very, very high interest rate, more than 50%, 50% or above. You know, because you are poor, you don't have a house, you don't have nothing, you have no collateral, all you have is your wage that tomorrow you could lose. So the company charge you to give you a loan, they charge you really very high interest rate. So you work, and get more and more and more into that. This is like, you know, that's a very, very, so it's not so much the kind of work, but it's the condition of their work. I think that it's very, very problematic. Yeah. Other comments? Yes. Sure. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the talk. I'm struck by what you were saying, that there's been an increase in recent years of violence against women in terms of the numbers and qualitatively. And I'm kind of interested in kind of where that comes from, and that perhaps it could be a kind of positive result of consciousness raising of an increase in recognition of acts as violence.
No. It's really increasing. No. It's really, the number of women killed is actually increased enormously. I mean, not accidentally, the concept of feminicide. Actually, the violence is still extremely underreported. It's very underreported. You know, people are not particularly, there's a whole area of violence that is taking place in the family, or in movements, right? I mean, recently I've had discussions with women who have been raped, you know, by comrades, and the urge to silence it. Let's not talk about it. You know, in mixed organization, let's not talk about it, because we are under attack by the fascists, and so you cannot denounce the comrade who has raped you, right? But this is a logic that, believe it or not, is still working. So I say, oh, really? So because of the fascists, now we accept our little fascism here, that we don't deal with it. And I say, well, tell these comrades that they are sabotaging the struggle. And by silencing it, you're also sabotaging it. Because what kind of world we are going to bring in this kind of situation? Yeah, so there is definitely a recorded mass increase. Even Italy has introduced the crime of femicide in 2016. In 2016, because the number of women killed has really escalated, you know, almost every year. Yeah.
I have a question. In your book,
sure.
You show how big, powerful institutions corrupt conceptions like yours of the commons.
Yes.
And I'm really afraid of that, also in my own work. So I wonder what your
Yeah, because I think there's a lot of misconception, and having more time is important. You know, for instance, for me, the question of the commons is not only a question of, you know, sharing the wealth, sharing the work, and of course self-government, right? Making decisions collectively. It's also a question of reappropriating, using the solidarity and the strength that comes from that cooperation and solidarity, to wage a whole mobilization to reappropriate wealth. And that cannot be co-opted. The World Bank is not interested in us reappropriating the wealth that we have produced or access to the natural wealth, the forests, the seas, etc. On the contrary, their historic mission is really to enclose. This is a new period of enclosure. It's a maximum period today of enclosure. So I think that there are ways in which the commons that I think we should fight for, and the commons that the World Bank says they are the protector of the global commons, right? And they protect it by enclosing it, by privatizing it, right? By expelling the indigenous people who live on them. And that's exactly the opposite of, I think, what we should do. In fact, it's really, using the collective power to begin a process of reappropriation of wealth, right? Yes, one more, yeah? Okay.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the kind of models of social organization that we should be promoting that recenter social reproduction and can replace capitalist models of the male breadwinner model or the gendered adult worker models.
Right,
For example, I was wondering what you think of Nancy Fraser's universal carer model, if that's something that you find useful in your work, or if you're... I'm sorry, I don't read much Nancy Fraser, but tell me, what is her model, universal care model? Yeah, so she speaks of a universal carer model.
And what does that mean?
Well, it's her vision of recentering social reproduction, that we're all first and foremost carers for each other rather than workers.
And how do we care for each other?
I mean, I think she uses it as a suggestion for further.
The problem I have, and that's one of the reasons I always found Nancy Fraser very vague on the practicalities. The care model. I mean, now there's been now decades, I think, of feminist talk about care work and care. The question is, what strategically today, can we do or should we do in terms of beginning to move towards the model, right? Or beginning to actually make care reproduction. And I'm always very uncomfortable also with the question of care, because care, of course, it's very, how can you not appreciate the notion of care? But we never talked about care in the 70s. We always talked about reproduction, domestic work, housework. And only later, I think by the mid-80s, more or less at the time when the United Nations comes in and appropriate the feminist agenda, and they appropriate the feminist language, but also slowly modified. You begin to have all this care. Well, the fear that I have, although I use care work myself, but the fear that I have on concentrating exclusively on care and not using a broader category like reproduction is that it implicitly creates a new hierarchy in reproductive labor. Not because implicitly suggests that reproduction is all about emotional work, etc., etc. So cleaning the floors or cooking and so. Well, François Vergès, I like very much. I don't know if you know François Vergès. She has written about cleaning the floor is care. Domestic work is care. But the fear is that how often it is used, care work, right? It seems to leave aside the more physical aspect and introduce among the workers themselves a kind of differentiation between the care workers, so we care for the elderly and we care for the children, but there's less and less talk also about the physical aspect, which are inseparable from their work, and potentially introduced surreptitiously some hierarchy. So to me, the question today of reproductive work, as we say, placing reproduction at the center of the struggle, which I'm very in agreement with, placing reproduction. There are many aspects of that move, but one is the question of the appropriation. Somehow, somewhere, there has to be a struggle and organizing that deals with the question of reappropriating resources, forcing the state and capital to relinquish resources of all types, whether it is housing, money, land, depending on the context, depending on the place. But we cannot imagine reorganizing reproduction purely on the basis of cooperation. Cooperation is essential, but cooperation is also essential to strengthen our capacity of confrontation with the state and the capacity. We cannot create the commons on the basis of sheer poverty. That's, I think, very important. Secondly, the organization of the work. Today, for instance, as much as we want to go beyond the state and ignore the state, we cannot go beyond the state. So somehow, part of the discussion of how we organize our reproduction is what do we do in relation with the state? Because the reality is that if I get sick now, probably I go to an ambulance and I go to an hospital, right? Then we still depend on the institution, which is the state, right? Because we don't have the means, the capacity as of now, or because we have been expropriated so much that we still are dependent on the state for much of our reproduction. So for years and years, a lot of feminists, socialist feminists, and I don't know when Nancy Fraser was on that, right, have told us that, well, the struggle is for better social services from the state, right? Obviously acknowledging the fact that we still depend on the state. But I don't think that's enough. I don't think we can demand and allow the state just to organize, what they do with our children in a daycare, what they do with our children in school. The educational system is a disaster. What kind of health they are going to give us, what they think is health, which is what the disaster that we encounter when we are sick and we go to a hospital. So to me, one of the questions and the thing to organize and mobilize around today, hand in hand with this process of appropriation, is also how do we create structures from below, forms of mobilization from below that are capable of interchanging and controlling, for instance, what kind of services we want and we get from the state, right? So to me, the question of building commons from below has to begin now. This has been happening, I've seen it happen in many, many, many different places, right? At times in moments of special insurgency, the Asambleas Populares of Latin America, right, where you decide what to do, what we need, how we organize. Why don't we have Asambleas Populares in our neighborhood? Talking about health, talking about what happens when we go to hospitals, talking about what happens when we go to give birth, that for many women has become a nightmare, talking about the fact that we don't want to be forced to have cesarean cuts, etc., etc., etc. Or that we don't want the kind of daycare that public institutions are organizing for our children. So how do we begin now to start building and exercising the capacity of control and regaining the capacity to control some of the most important aspects of our everyday life? So we might not be able now to say no to the state, which is what the neoliberal politicians want us to say, your bootstraps, right? Do what you're on, fuck. I mean, but in a very different way. have the ability to control, and also working with people who are within the state institution. There is a world of disgruntled nurses. Nurses have been very revolutionary in the United States. Many of them have joined movement, were during Occupy. Some have gone to the Occupy camps and offer their services, work with people, and they have led, I think, the move to say no to the blackmail, right? Because they are continuously blackmailed. How can you go on strike? How can you do this and this, right? You have people's life in your hand. Meanwhile, they are continuously cutting the personnel. They are continuously increasing their hours. And then when there is an accident, they blame the nurses, right? And so they've been protesting. They're saying, no, our protest is actually, beneficial to the people that we care for. Because protesting, is forcing the hospital to add more people, to reduce the work hours. So that's the kind of thing. I think it's a scandal, for instance. I don't know Scotland or England, but I know in the United States it's amazing the disconnect between teachers and families. The amount of time the teachers and family come together is very, very little. Very, very little. Maybe once or twice a year in most cases in the public school, right? Teachers are on the move now in the US. They've really been protagonists of some of the most important struggles. And they've really brought also a whole new reality and understanding of what's happening. For instance, they have told us that the reason a lot of children are not paying attention in school is not because they are mentally sick, Right now the state has classified more than 8 million children in the United States as being mentally ill. And they're drugging them from age 4 on. They're giving them a huge amount of pills, Ritalin, Prozac, hyperactivity, depression, attention deficit in school. Anyway, they are saying children don't pay attention because they are hungry. But generally, they don't have time. The work time of the parents and the work time of the nursing is such that they don't have time to meet. So this is the terrain of struggle. Liberate work time. Reduce work. Obviously, we're talking about a front of struggle where the struggle has to connect to each other. The struggle to reduce the amount of time that people work has to connect with the struggle for people to be able to come in the community, in the neighborhood, whatever place, to discuss together what kind of help do we want, what does it mean, what is happening in this hospital. A little bit of that is already going on. For example, and this I conclude, in the US, black women, have in the reproductive justice movement, which they have built in alternative to the choice movement, because the idea of choice they think is ridiculous. But the reproductive justice movement, because you're not just equating abortion with choice, it's really, really inappropriate. Abortion may be a negative sign, but what about the right, the possibility of having children also, in conditions in which many women don't have that possibility? But what an institution they are beginning to develop is that of the doula. It's a woman's advocate that comes with you when you go to give birth, and that in a way defends you and makes sure that in this moment when you need to concentrate on your body and concentrate on what you're doing, you're not being brutalized, you're not being humiliated, you're not being forced to procedures that you do not want, like being forced to have a cesarean cut, right? Or being forced to have an epidural injection that practically paralyzes your legs. And so I think that this is the kind of things that reclaiming in our hands, the decision of power on our reproduction and our life. Thank you.